Turn it up a little bit. My name is Stephen McLeod, and I'm the Director of Library Programs here at the Washington Library. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to begin by thanking our generous donor, the Ford Motor Company, who's had a long relationship with Mount Vernon over many, many years, and they underwrite this series free and open to the public for all of you to enjoy. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind you of a few upcoming events. Our next evening book talk will take place here in this room on February the 7th, where we will welcome Dr. Phil Levy from the University of South Florida, who's going to be talking about his new book, The Permanent Resident: Excavations and Explorations of George Washington's Life. So he's an archaeologist, and he's going to look at different places associated with George Washington's life from an archaeological perspective. And on March 8th, in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, we will welcome Neil O'Dowd, who will be discussing his new book, George Washington and the Irish. And this event will be followed by a reception, and it'll take place again here in the library. And now to introduce our esteemed speaker. Dr. Edward J. Larson is the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law at Pepperdine University. Prior to this important post, he was the Herman E. Talmadge Chair of Law and the Richard B. Russell Professor of American History at the University of Georgia. He's a graduate of Williams College. He earned his J.D. from Harvard and his Ph.D. in history in the history of science from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Dr. Larson received the 1998 Pulitzer Prize for History for his book, Summer of the Gods: The Scopes Trial and America's Continuing Debate of Science and Religion. Since then, he's published a number of books on our nation's founding era, including The Magnificent Catastrophe, The Tumultuous Election of 1800, The Return of George Washington, and Franklin and Washington, The Founding Partnership. He was a member of the Washington Library's inaugural 2013-2014 class of research fellows, and he was here again as a member of our 2021-22 class of fellows, during which time he worked on the book he's here to talk about tonight. He's been a great friend to Mount Vernon over many years, and we are thrilled that he chose the Washington Library as the site for the official launch of his new book, American Inheritance: Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. So please join me in a warm Mount Vernon welcome for Dr. Ed Larson. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for bringing me back. And thank you for all of you for coming out on this morning and this evening. And when you told about the books to come, I haven't seen it in particular, but I would imagine that book on Washington and the Irish is fascinating, because the Irish embraced George Washington. They were in the process of trying to distance themselves from the British back then, and Washington became a national hero in Ireland. So I would imagine that was a wonderful, wonderful, exciting story. So again, thank you for having me back, and thank you for this warm introduction. I'm going to try to be a little. Excuse me. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to thank you for that. And also, I'm going to try to be a little briefer, because I greatly enjoy answering questions. So I want to save plenty of time for questions, because I know I don't want to keep you too late. Most nations are built on ethnicity, like Poland for the Poles, or Thailand for the Thais, or legacies of conquest, like the grand sweep of Russia and the chock-a-block nations of the once colonized African or South American continent, or in religious or geopolitical divisions from Hindu India and Jewish Israel to island nations like Iceland or Japan. From its outset, however, from its founding as a nation, the United States stood out as a land of liberty. the geographical manifestation of a then new Enlightenment era political idea. Conceived in liberty was how Abraham Lincoln put it 77 years after its establishment. So tonight, permit me to explore how this national identity tied to a idea came about in the colonies, 13 Atlantic colonies, where slavery had already become endemic. By taking you back not to their founding in the 1600s, but to the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, a crisis occasioned by the decision of Parliament in London for the first time to impose direct internal taxes on its American colonists. There we find this ideal of liberty and the fact of slavery inexorably intertwined in surprising ways. Now, so let me take you back. The spreading American elm at the corner of Essex and Orange Street in Boston's Old South End had served as a local landmark for decades. At dawn on August 14, 1765, the patriot leader of the South End gang, shoemaker Ebenezer McIntosh, signaled the start of organized, violent resistance to the Stamp Act by hanging from that tree an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the Act's supposed administrator and tax collector for Massachusetts, with a sign reading, "In Praise of Liberty." Known thereafter as Liberty Tree, that elm served as a rallying point for patriots in their fight against taxation without representation. A riotous crowd, composed mostly of workers, at least some of whom came armed with clubs and staves, soon surrounded the tree. Acting at the behest of the Loyal Nine, a clandestine committee of patriot artisans and merchants that soon expanded under the leadership of James Otis Jr. and Samuel Adams to become the Sons of Liberty, McIntosh had united the rival North and South End gangs to make common cause against the Stamp Act. Oliver's brother-in-law, the Loyalist Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, immediately sensed trouble and directed the sheriff to remove the effigy, objecting that his officers, and I'm quoting here, could not do so without imminent danger to their lives. The sheriff demurred. Tensions rose as the day wore on without decisive action. At dusk, leaders of the swelling crowd, which one local newspaper numbered at, quote, some thousands in a town with under 16,000 people, took down the effigy and with mob in tow, paraded it roughly a mile to Oliver's Wharf. There, rioters demolished a new brick and wood building rumored to serve as the future office for administrating the tax. With the effigy and with kindling from the demolished building, the crowd then passed by Oliver's stately home. After beheading the effigy in plain sight of the house's terrified occupants, protesters set it ablaze on a nearby hilltop in a bonfire that was visible across town from one end of Boston to the other, before storming the house, which Oliver and his family had just vacated. Helping themselves to Oliver's liquor, the rioters broke windows and mirrors, smashed furniture, tore down the fence, and made a general mess of the place. Hutchinson and the sheriff tried to disperse the mob around 11 o'clock, but were driven off in a shower of stones. The next day, to save himself from further injury, Oliver agreed to decline his commission as stamp agent and to do nothing further to execute the Stamp Act. Word spread, however, that Hutchinson and agents of the local customs office and Admiralty Court remained committed to enforcing the Stamp Act. The mob turned against them on the night of August 26, invading and trashing the homes of the comptroller of currency, court officers, and Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor. The militia finally turned out to keep peace after the second night of rioting, but Patriot leaders warned against jailing anyone for the attacks, or more riots would follow. No prosecutions ensued. Francis Bernard, the colony's royal governor, who by then was holed up on an offshore British fort, let everyone know that he would not press the issue of stamps. The Sons of Liberty ruled Boston. As news of these actions spread from Massachusetts, other British mainland colonies, including Virginia, erupted. All the power of Great Britain shall not obligate them to submit to the Stamp Act, Bernard reported about the protesters in Boston and elsewhere in his official report back to England. Then he said, they, meaning the protesters, they will die first. As events in Boston suggested, the Stamp Act crisis seeded a new spirit of liberty in the colonies. Occurring in 1765, shortly after the tumultuous and disorientating 7 Years' War ended, or the French and Indian War, as it was called in the United States, in America, it prompted mainland American colonists to fear for their liberty and property under British rule. It gave substance to widely circulating political conspiracy theories spun by opposition wing partisans against the monarchy in England and widely known there, and spread by American patriots to implicate Parliament as well as the king, about the supposed absolutist designs of Britain's Hanoverian kings, the first three Georges, to enslave their subjects. It led prosperous colonial lawyers, planters, and merchants from New England to the Carolinas, many of whom owned enslaved blacks, to express apprehension that they, to use their own oft-repeated formulation, would not become Parliament's Negroes. As a result, the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 became a critical step in the march from colonialism to revolution and independence, with liberty as its watchword. Now, the crisis rested on a subtle but significant difference in perspective, repeatedly raised in pamphlets and proclamations. The Pennsylvania Assembly, for example, resolved in defiance of the Stamp Act, it is the inherent birthright, an indubitable privilege of every British subject, and they're including them, of course, within that group, to be taxed only by his own consent or that of his legal representatives. And of course, the colonists in America or Pennsylvania or any of the colonies did not have a legal representative in Parliament. By imposing internal stamp taxes on them, the American colonists, without their consent, taxes evidenced by stamps on all locally produced printed items and written documents, Parliament supposedly enslaved colonists. You have been told by great authority that a respectful submission is your duty, a Boston newspaper essayist counseled colonists in 1765. And so it is with your brother Americans the Black inhabitants of the West India Islands. Their duty is certainly to submit to all the impositions of their masters, for we know they were created for no other end but with the sweat of their brow to support them in luxury. He knew slavery was wrong. As we'll see, as we go through these people, they all knew slavery was wrong, and they were drawing an analogy based on that. Well, those British overlords in London saw matters fundamentally differently. The English paid stamp acts too, they noted, and so colonists had a form of virtual representation by having the tax imposed by others who bore similar, although not the same ones. In any event, those British overlords added, its proceeds offset the cost of colonial administration. These defenses meant little to most American colonists at the time, who saw the Stamp Act imposing on them, without their consent, a direct tax that, while lower than a similar ones in England, Parliament could unilaterally raise. Indeed, that was precisely the goal of British Prime Minister George Grenville, who wanted to establish the principle of absolute parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies, even in tax matters. All this played into the hands of James Otis Jr., who had long spoiled for such a fight. A gifted lawyer and popular local politician with a history of opposing British imperial impositions, Otis had the public standing and ready arguments to pounce in 1774 when Parliament announced the forthcoming stamp tax. That is, it would be coming the following year. One of the first pamphlets published in response, and by far the best known and most often reprinted one of the age, Otis's The Rights of the British Colonies asserted, denied the right of Parliament to pose any external tariffs or internal taxes exclusively or solely on unrepresented colonists. General taxes maybe that applied to all Britons everywhere, but none that were imposed directly and solely on the colonists. Every British subject born on the continent of America or in any other of the British domains is entitled to all the natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights of our fellow subjects in Great Britain, Otis wrote. No act of Parliament can deprive them of the liberties of such unless any will contend that an act of Parliament can make slaves, underlined, not only of one, but of 2 million of the Commonwealth, the estimated English-American population. No man can take my property without my consent, Otis thundered. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. Clearly, he knew that slavery was wrong. Indeed, he went on in this pamphlet to say that such impositions would be wrong on blacks or whites, and that blacks or whites should not be subject to slavery. Now, following Otis's lead, 2 other pamphleteers depicted the Stamp Act as a form of enslavement. This usage did not mean that those 2 prominent colonists, Rhode Island governor, merchant, and slave ship owner Stephen Hopkins, and Maryland colonial secretary, the London trained barrister, and slave plantation owner Daniel Delaney, employed slavery merely as a trope to assail taxation without representation. While modern readers cannot read the word without thinking of Africans in chains, Hopkins and Delaney had something else in mind. Hopkins opened his pamphlet by declaring, "Liberty is the greatest blessing that men enjoy, and slavery the heaviest curse that human nature is capable of. Those who are governed at the will of another, and whose property may be taken from them by taxes or otherwise, without their consent and against their will, are in a miserable condition of slavery." While these definitions of liberty and slavery echoed established English Whig usage, Hopkins relied on the ubiquity of Black slavery in America to give them added force. More conservative than Hopkins, and not a firebrand like Otis, the Cambridge-educated Delaney also gave a proper English meaning to the word slavery. Perhaps for that reason, his pamphlet carried more weight in London than other colonial tracts, and along with the widespread protests and very effective boycotts that ground tax collections to a halt, led Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, less than a year after its imposition. There may very well exist a dependency and inferiority without absolute vassalage and slavery, Delaney wrote with lawyer-like precision. In what the superior may rightfully control or compel, and in what the inferior ought to be at liberty to act without control or compulsion, depends upon the nature of the dependency and degree of the subordination. He went on, though, to make clear that regardless of the degree of subordination, colonies owed properly to Parliament external tariffs. And while, internal tariffs might not cross that line, internal taxes like the Stamp Act surely did. In accord with Delaney's view of the dependency of colonies on the mother country, Parliament paired its repeal of the Stamp Act with the passage of the American Colonies Act of 1766. This so-called Declaratory Act avowed that Parliament, and I'm quoting here from the Act, had full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and the people of America in all cases whatsoever. As face-saving words, these might not have mattered, but after Parliament proceeded under them to impose new import tariffs on the colonies in 1768 and 1769, the slavery trope reappeared with a vengeance. Even during the Stamp Act crisis, and more so thereafter, the pamphlets by Otis, Hopkins, Delaney, and more, I could have read from dozens of them, did not stand out because they used the metaphor of slavery to assail British imperial policies. That usage was common. It was common in newspapers. It was common in normal conversations, in letters. It was common. They stood out for their impact. That's why I picked Otis, Hopkins, and Delaney, which resulted from their effective use of revolutionary rhetoric, particularly the slavery metaphor. A striking yet representative example appeared at the height of the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, when Massachusetts Patriot leader John Adams, the future conservative American president and Washington's vice president, inveighed against British treatment of the colonists. We won't be their Negroes. Whatever meaning or implications it carried in a particular cases, the slavery metaphor worked with free white colonists because they did not want to become like the enslaved African in their midst. In every colony, they knew slavery firsthand. They almost invariably knew it was wrong, and they certainly rejected it for themselves. Repeal of the Stamp Act had followed Grenville's fall in July of 1765 and his replacement as prime minister by Lord Rockingham, who supported constitutional rights for colonists. Rockingham lasted only a year in the post, however. He never really had the king's support. With the Grenville-like Charles Townshend then put in charge of tax policy, Parliament in 1767 passed the so-called Townshend Act or Townshend tariffs, imposing revenue import duties on tea, paper, glass, lead, and paint entering into the colonies. once again declaring that taxation without representation violated their rights as British citizens, the colonists erupted anew, repudiating any distinction between internal and external taxes. Patriot propagandists charged that all revenue measures imposed without their consent constituted slavery. Effective in challenging the stamp taxes, use of the metaphor exploded against the Townshend tariffs. With Otis by then increasingly sidelined by mental illness, Samuel Adams assumed the leading role within Boston's chapter of the Sons of Liberty and the far-reaching committees of correspondence, which stretched their tentacles throughout the colonies. A gifted polemicist, more than that of any other single person, Samuel Adams, became the voice of colonial resistance to the Townshend Act. He used the slavery metaphor as sharply as Otis ever had. Having previously denounced the Stamp Act as reducing colonists, and I'm quoting here, reducing colonists from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves, Samuel Adams now turned his fury on the Townshend duties. Slavery, my dear mother, we cannot think of it. We detest it, he wrote in a widely publicized public or open letter, ostensibly to Britain, the mother country. If this be a crime, that is, detesting slavery, remember we sucked it at your milk. Quoting from the refrain of a popular English ballad that had recently come out and would soon become an unofficial British national anthem, Adams added, Britons will never, never be slaves. Adams carried on in this manner into the 1770s, admonishing colonists in his trademark fashion, is it not high time for the people of this country explicitly to declare whether they will be free men or slaves? Well, notwithstanding the overall influence of Adams's words, those of John Dickinson's anonymously issued letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania had the greatest impact of any single publication or series of publications in steeling Americans against the Townshend Act. Ostensibly written by a simple farmer, the 12 letters, which appeared first serially in 19 different colonial newspapers from New England to the Carolinas, beginning in 1767, and then together in a group as pamphlets published in 7 cities from Philadelphia to Paris in 1768, displayed legal acumen and a style that engaged readers of all stripes. Born on his father's tobacco plantation in Maryland and raised at the family plantation in Delaware that he later inherited, Dickinson held estates in Pennsylvania through marriage. He worked his land with enslaved blacks, owning more of them than anyone else in the region. To the delight of patriots and fury of loyalists, Dickinson turned the slavery metaphor against the Townshend Acts in his letters, portraying himself and his ilk as the enslaved bondservants of Britain. Dickinson had used the metaphor earlier to assail the Stamp Act, writing in 1765 as in a published letter, as signed as, quote, a gentleman of Philadelphia. He wasn't yet a farmer from Pennsylvania. He depicted stamp taxes much like a master's leash, and I'm quoting here, drawing off, as it were, the last drop of their prey's blood. Stating, every drop of my blood is British. He railed against the act that British leaders should, quote, should be better pleased having their children speaking the language of freemen than muttering the timid murmurs of slaves. Well, the metaphor worked better when attributed to the humble hand of, in letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. "My farm is small, my servants few and good," the first letter began. "I have a little money at interest and wish no more." This opening hardly pointed toward the cool conservative Dickinson, who had many enslaved servants and much cash, but his fictional farmer could make the metaphor sing for moderate Whigs and white artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. Quote, "The Parliament unquestionably possesses a legal authority to regulate the trade of Great Britain and her colonies," Dickinson wrote in the second letter. The single question is, he asserted, whether Parliament can legally take money out of our pockets without our consent. If they can, all of our boasted liberties is but a sound and nothing else. In letter 7, he declared, "Those who are taxed without their own consent, expressed by themselves or their representatives, are slaves. We are taxed without our consent, given by ourselves or our representatives. We are therefore," and I speak it with grief, I speak it with indignation, "we are slaves." The Townshend Act reduced colonists to the state of abject slavery. Those are Dickinson's words. He wrote, "Is it possible to form any idea of slavery more complete, more miserable, more disgraceful than that of a people where justice is administered, government exercised, and a standing army maintained at the expense of the people, and yet without the least dependence on them?" It was a rhetorical question. Read by Southern planters and Northern farmers, in New York pubs and London clubs, by the colonial elite and working poor, Dickinson's letters had much the same impact on public debate over the Townshend duties as Delaney's pamphlets had regarding the Stamp Act. Written from a conservative perspective, both crystallized the issues at stake in terms of English liberty versus African slavery, and awakened colonists to the patriot cause. From his vast Virginia plantation, George Washington, after reading these letters, wrote to George Mason early in 1769, "At a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom, it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the stroke and maintain the liberty which we have derived from our ancestors." Now, each one of these men, Mason and Washington, owned over 100 enslaved blacks, and both, having read Dickinson's letters, by mid-1769, Washington and Mason organized a boycott of British goods by Virginia planters with the goal, in Washington's words, quote, "of drawing Parliament's attentions to our rights and privileges by starving their trade and manufacture." Patriot leaders in other colonies did likewise, with remarkable effect. Trade on taxed goods plummeted and smuggling soared. Matters only became worse after resistance to the Townshend Act in Boston led the British to dispatch warships and troops to enforce compliance there, resulting in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. Although the news had not yet reached America yet, in response to the ongoing boycotts, Parliament had already largely repealed the Townshend tariffs. To maintain the principle of its sovereignty, as we all know, taxes retained the import tax on tea. That, coupled with outrage over the Boston Massacre, kept the situation in the colonies fluid, with the committees of correspondence urging a sustained boycott everywhere. Into the 1770s, prominent patriots persisted in protesting their enslavement by Britain in passages laced with the imagery of Black slavery. Quote, "Those from whom we have a right to seek protection are endeavoring at every piece of art, by every piece of art and despotism to fix the shackles of slavery upon us." Those were the words of George Washington in June 1774, saying the British, to whom we have a right to seek protection, are endeavoring by every piece of art to fix shackles of slavery upon us. Parliament, Washington added too much later, sought to make, and I'm quoting here too, to make colonists as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. In a widely read pamphlet, South Carolina planter William Henry Drayton exclaimed that same year, "It is as clear as the sun at noon that the taxation of America by Parliament serves to compel America to bow the neck to slavery. By accepting the Townsend tariffs," John Adams chided Bostonians a year later, "you would not only be slaves, but the most abject sort of slaves to the worst sort of masters." With British troops occupying Boston in 1775, Harvard President Samuel Langdon depicted colonists' plight as the vilest slavery. Following Dickinson, a wide array of patriot essayists employed the slavery metaphor. Virginia planter Thomas Jefferson, New York lawyer Alexander Hamilton, Philadelphia writer Tom Paine, South Carolina merchant Charles Gadsden, and more and more and more. No longer merely common, its use became ubiquitous. Words drove the opening phase of the American Revolution, most historians agree, until the violence of it, especially on the western frontier and the southern colonies, became its own driver and pushed it on. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was affected from 1760 to 1775, John Adams later wrote to Jefferson. The pamphlets and newspapers in all the colonies are to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. That was how John Adams remembered it. For embattled colonists, those revolutionary inspiring words featured liberty as the ultimate good and slavery as the absolute evil. As the quoted passages also suggested, patriot invocations of liberty and slavery were often not enlightenment arguments based on abstract notions of free persons in a state of nature. They were intensely emotional appeals that relied for their force on familiarity with chattel slavery. There are two sorts of men in the world, John Adams declared, freemen and slaves. In their mind's eye, Americans were either Dickinson's white yeoman farmers living securely on a bit of investment income, or in a state of abject chattel slavery, living like enchained blacks without recourse or rights. If we accepted taxation without representation, Massachusetts orator Joseph Warren warned, quote, "We must admit at once that we are absolute slaves and have no property of our own." Pleas for liberty and warnings about slavery drove the call to arms. Those usages never worked better for this purpose than on March 23, 1775, when the spellbinding Virginia orator, country lawyer, and rising plantation slaveholder Patrick Henry stood at an unsanctioned meeting of his colony's assembly to demand armed resistance to ongoing acts of British tyranny, particularly what was happening under the coercive or intolerable acts in Massachusetts. "The question before this House," Henry began, speaking in the third person before shifting to the first, "was one of awful moment to this country. For his part, he considered it nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. Shall we require the means of effectual resistance by lying sublimely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound our hands and our feet? He asked in a clear allusion to chattel slavery. No, Henry explained. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. Then came the haunting close we all know. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. For Henry and many others caught up in the rush toward revolution, slavery was not an option. Liberty became their cause, and America, already a diverse place composed of 13 separate states and born as a nation not built on a common British ethnic or Anglican religious identity, already with French and Dutch and Catholics in different mix. With eyes firmly fixed on Western expansion, not on a delineated geographical space that this is our country, but no, looking westward to expand this nation there. Built not on the religious identity, therefore, not on an ethnic identity, not on a geographical delineation, but on a shared commitment to liberty and a determination not to become enslaved. That was its reason for being. The United States, as Lincoln would say 87 years later, was a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated by its Declaration of Independence to the proposition that all are created equal. These form a common and enduring American inheritance and remain its noblest, if not yet fully realized, ideal. Thank you. I have tried to leave plenty of time for questions. I aimed for 40 minutes and I managed to hit it. I see a question down there. Stephen will bring you a microphone, if that's okay, and I will drink a glass of little water.
I'm curious at how realistic in their minds was that ideal that they would become the slavery that they're so close to, or was this much more of a rhetorical device? Because it seems a lot of their gripes had to do with losing economic power, but not necessarily all the other losses of human rights that you get with the slavery that they are so familiar with.
It's a good question.
And then,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
All right. And then the second part of that then is why weren't they going to something more tied to English history, like peasantry or a higher, like the kingly power controlling them? Those questions might be too different. So you can stick with those.
No, I think they're connected, certainly. Well, England was it's interesting because they borrowed these metaphors. Now remember, liberty as we conceive of it was a new Enlightenment era vision. It really wasn't the liberty that the Greeks and the Romans thought about. It was a new development, Rousseau, Locke, all the Enlightenment era. So that still made it 100 years old at the time of the American Revolution. And with roots further back. England, and so in England, you already see among the Whig writers who feared the Hanoverian monarchy, the use of the word, this modern use of the word liberty, and the slavery metaphor. It was widely used in theirs. But there it had a different feel and a different meaning because there was no slavery in England. There was no slavery in Europe. It had been ended with the fall of the Roman Empire. And if they looked back at slavery, unless they looked overseas, But they look back, they had to look back to the Roman slavery, which would be the slavery of the Greeks or other conquered peoples, which was fundamentally different than the chattel slavery that had developed in Brazil by the Portuguese and then sort of codified first in Barbados and then carried from Barbados up to South Carolina, and then from South Carolina spread throughout the colonies. That sort of slavery, but that's the slavery they experienced. So the metaphor that they borrowed has a different force and feel and ubiquitousness in the American colonies. You can see it. You can see where they're getting it. You can see it in the Whig writers. You can see it even in Locke. But you never see it like this. And how much did they really fear it? And how much was it a rhetorical device? Well, I think in England, it was a messaging device of some sort, and it had a certain meaning, but not the meaning it carried in America, where all around you in every colony had chattel slavery. That is a heredited, inherited sort of slavery, and you could see it. It was everywhere, and so the device carries a lot more force in America. Did they actually feel? It's hard to believe when you read them. When you read somebody like Hopkins using this, or everybody using it, it's hard to believe when they said we have the most abject form of slavery. We have the worst form of slavery. And you're looking, really? Look what's happening. And yet it clearly carried force for the people who heard it, for working class people living in these colonies, who are people who themselves didn't necessarily have that much of had a pretty oppressed life. Yeah, it carried meaning. I think it carried real meaning. And I think they knew it carried that meaning because you see it used so commonly, so much, and is repeated so often where the English Whig writers would never use it so constantly. And did they believe it? They may have come to believe it. I mean, think if you're living in Ukraine right now. Yeah, you thought one thing about the Russians when it all began, and you have a very different view of the Russian oppression now after they're blowing up everybody's houses. And I think that it had a strong effect on the common people and the people reading it in the newsletters and in the pamphlets. It had a strong effect on there, and it had a reinforcing effect among themselves. So I do think maybe you read it and you say, really? Do they fear that's what the parliament's going to do to them? But to an extent, yeah. Ideas have force. Ideas have power, and they become a driving force. I hope that answers your question.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Did liberty, the idea of liberty and slavery, it actually did change. Liberty did work, the metaphor, because it went from liberty to independence. Independence wasn't, in my understanding, what people were after initially. They were after liberty, not necessarily independence.
Yes.
So it did move. It
Yes.
did move the ball to that. I just had a comment on that, and
Good point. Thank you.
But I had another little question. I was really intrigued when you said that Dickinson was able to publish in 19 various newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
How in the heck did he organize that? Did you find when you were researching, who did that for him, or was it just the editors moving?
The later. What happened back then, and I've done a lot of work on colonial newspapers and Revolutionary era newspapers and newspapers in the 1790s. There were no copyright laws, and there were newspapers all over because Americans, the literacy rate in the colonies was very high compared to anywhere else in the world, compared to England, and they needed content. And so newspapers, editors would buy newspapers, would get newspapers, so they would read other newspapers, and things they liked in it, they just printed. They just took them and put them in there, sort of like kids do with the web now, and just publish it, or this as their own. And so, but no, they'll give credit. They'll say from a gentleman, from a farmer in Philadelphia. And so you can watch these move out if you use some wonderful source like the American Antiquarian Society's collections of American newspapers, and you can watch. You can figure back where it was originally published by reading those newspapers, and you can watch it move. You can watch it first published, say, in Philadelphia, and then 3 days later in Baltimore, and then a week later in Charleston, maybe, or New York. And so that's how it spreads. It's not that Dickinson, but what it shows, even more than Dickinson arranging it, it shows that this idea had force, that people chose to republish this that many times. And that's a lot of times because there are not that many newspapers. And then bringing it together and publishing it as a pamphlet, and then same way with books. They weren't copyrighted either. So you get a copy of it, and London just can print another one, or they have one in Philadelphia and somebody in Boston gets it, and you can just set the type and print it as a pamphlet there. And so therefore, if it does get reprinted, you can see the reach of an idea, but also probably not the superficial reach, but also the depth of the idea going down by looking at how often it's reproduced and how widely, and also where. Does this resonate in the South or the North? Well, you can see, and Dickinson's that's what makes them interesting, is that really resonated everywhere. Resonated in London, you could tell because of the way it was republished there. And it resonated in North and South because where it's spreading. Other ideas like Thomas Paine's writing might resonate up toward Massachusetts, but not South. It just, you can follow that through studying the spread of an idea and the picking up of an idea, and then also the republishing as a book. So it turns out to be a very useful device for trying to gauge that. Not foolproof, and it certainly gives you a clue of how many people are reading it.
Did any of these pamphleteers sort of reflect on rank hypocrisy and some of the claims that were made by English critics like Samuel Johnson, who said that the loudest proponents of liberties were the drivers of Negro slaves? I mean, it just seems to me so obvious that these claims that slavery was facing, colonial elites would open one up for, just sort of self-criticism, self-thought about what they were actually doing. I mean, like John Lawrence, the young South Carolina planter, he sort of was an early abolitionist. Were there other people who changed their views based on this rhetoric of liberty and slavery?
Absolutely. And James Otis would be the first example of it. When he wrote in his pamphlet, he went on and said, right in that pamphlet, that initial pamphlet, using it, says, he attacked African slavery. We can't argue for this. And yes, and this is, and many American writers noted, you see the American Revolution occasioned the first great emancipation of African slaves in the history of the world. In the middle of the revolution, Pennsylvania passed a statute for the gradual emancipation. Not at the end, in the middle of it. In the middle of the revolution, Massachusetts adopted a constitution that ended slavery, and they knew it did. They'd proposed an earlier one 2 years before, and it was the only state constitution that was voted down by the people, and it was voted down because it didn't abolish slavery, and so the new one did in 1780. Vermont wrote a constitution to abolish slavery. So yes, you see this beginning with Otis. You see it in John Hancock. He wouldn't take any slaves. Gouverneur Morris wouldn't take an inheritance that included slaves. Samuel Adams wouldn't accept when he got married, bringing slaves into the household. Yes, you do see this with people, and the abolitionist movement grows during the Revolutionary period. from a small, rather odd opposition by Quakers. And Quakers were viewed as a very odd people back then because they had direct messages from God. You know, you'd be hung if you were a Quaker in Massachusetts. It was considered heresy. It was a small movement. It had turned against slavery. But what happens during the Revolution is it spreads wider. The Congregational Church, which is a proto-evangelical church in New England, turns against slavery. Methodist Church turns against slavery. You see it in the writing. You see it in the ratification debates in the North. You see it in the debates over the Massachusetts Constitution. You see it in so many ways. You see it in newspaper articles. Yes, many people saw this. And you saw British were not the only ones. You quoted beautifully. You quoted Johnson, the dictionary writer and essayist, who said, well, sneeringly, how come we hear the loudest yelps from freedom for drivers of Negroes? It didn't only come from him. Americans were saying this. Loyalists were saying it. Loyalist newspapers were constantly printing, well, look at George Washington. Look at, and pointing at the Carolinas and pointing at ones. Loyalists used it constantly. Perhaps the most famous example of that was the Loyalist writer Cravaker, who wrote letters from an American, it wasn't farmer, but letters from American farmer. Those were written, probably some of you have read them, Saint Jean Cravaker. He was a Frenchman living in America. And he wrote those letters. He was writing those letters and trying to get them published as an activity. And then he flees New York. He lived in he had a estate in the borderlands. He wrote the famous essay, What is an American? And he flew to England. And then to get them published, he recrafted them. And he had never been to South Carolina in his life, ever. He'd only been in the North. He was a slave owner himself in New York. You know, there were a lot of enslaved people in New York. And he added this letter from South Carolina, which is a violent attack on slavery, about the awfulness of slavery in South Carolina. He'd never been that. He talked about seeing enslaved people who were being punished, hanging in a tree, their eyes being picked out by powerful stuff. It was all made up. It was all fiction. Why did he make it up? Because he'd gotten over there, and this was in 1782. And he was working on it and trying to get it published in the early 1781. And he thought, this will sing. I will show how these South Carolinians have this violent, vile slavery, which he made up in his head. It may be true, but he never saw it. And his purpose was to undermine, because then if you know, the British troops had given up on New England and were trying to take back the Carolinas and Virginia, and that's where Clinton and Cornwallis were operating. And the idea was to undermine the patriots, showing them as vile slave owners compared to the benign slavery in New York. And he wrote whole different passages about it up there. But it was all made up. The purpose was to turn the British against the hypocrisy of the Southern slaveholders. Sure, there's an American using it. So yes, this was powerful rhetoric used on both sides.
Thank you. Okay, so we come much later. We know how things will end up. We know the nation. We can't help blaming the nation for the original sin of slavery. This is our perspective, of course. But as you bring, like you do, you bring the imperial perspective into the picture, because you talk about what happened in the 60s and the early 70s, and the nation wasn't looming yet. Very few had an idea about creating that kind of independence. So it's obvious that slavery gets diluted into the imperial dimension. So would you, and then responsibilities, from our point of view, we can't but saying that these people were duplicitous and disingenuous and hypocrites. But from their point of view, it was actually a blot in the imperial system rather than something that Americans were responsible. So how would you comment?
Well, certainly that was how Jefferson wanted to put it. That's why Jefferson initially puts in the Declaration of Independence as one of his indictments against the king that the king has repeatedly vetoed attempts by the colonies, which is true, to end the Atlantic slave trade. And that's another thing that shows that many of these Americans, even the slaveholders, knew it was wrong. And Washington knew it was wrong. I mean, you'd see that in his letters. And Jefferson clearly tried to turn. He knew the rhetorical devices. If Jefferson was nothing else, he was a great rhetorician and writer. And he had used it in the pamphlet that he had written, the same argument that used to get him the open spot in the Second Continental Congress when, who was it? Peyton Randolph came back home. I think it was Randolph, came back to be governor. And so Jefferson got to go up to the Second Continental Congress, and then he gets chosen to write to be the lead writer of the Declaration of Independence. So he uses the same. And one of the key rhetorical devices is it's really the British who imposed slavery on us. And the king, that's one of the king's crimes. But you notice it didn't make it through. That one was the one argument he made that the Carolinas and Georgia could not stomach. And they insisted they would not sign the Declaration of Independence unless he took that one out. So I think it's telling, and I think it's part of a larger system. And that sense that England, which would not own slaves, where slavery was prohibited in England, was against the law, reaffirmed by Lord Mansfield in the Somerset decision, but known, quoting decisions that had gone back hundreds of years, that the English air is too pure for a slave to breathe. That was the phrase used by Lord Mansfield and copied from earlier decisions. The fact that England would say that and yet profit and be perfectly happy if their colonists owned enslaved people, that's reinforced the sense. And Benjamin Franklin writes a lovely essay to this effect. Because if you really look closely, and other historians have done this as well as myself, if you look closely at George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, people who were really successful in the colonies, and you look at why they decided to revolt in a system they were doing quite well, one of their motives is they didn't think they were second class, and they were inevitably being treated as second class citizens. Washington, during the French and Indian War, he was a colonel in the Virginia militia. He tried and wanted to get a coordinate English rank, and they wouldn't give it to him. And that meant he was under the lowliest English officer, and he didn't like that. Franklin had similar experiences. Jefferson had similar, they wrote about them. And, John Adams was a walking sense of personal insecurity. And he would see him being slighted all the time by the British. And one of the senses of their slight was, yeah, they think they're too pure to have slaves. Oh, they look down on us. But we, with the Somerset decision, not only can we have enslaved people, we can't take them with us. We're richer than they are. I want my son goes to Oxford or Cambridge. My son goes to getting his law, studying the law at the Temple, in Lincoln's Inn or wherever. They can't take their personal servants with them, or they become immediately free. And that sense of second-class citizen, which the English imperial system allowed the colonists to be, they said, they just view us as some sort of heathens or beasts or third-class citizens. Well, they view us as subhuman. And that sense within the system contributed to it. And no other than Ben Franklin, who of course was the president of the first abolitionist society in America, and deeply anti-slavery, he attacks the Somerset decision on that very grounds. So yes, they see a hypocrisy back in England. They turned it back, but it was rhetoric that the British used against us. And of course, during the Revolutionary War, what did the British do? Clinton, if any patriot enslaved by anybody enslaved by patriots leave their masters and come behind British lines, you're free. Well, that's just what Lincoln did during the Civil War. It's playing on this, and it's part of imperial policy, but England had no intention whatsoever to get rid of slavery in their colonies because it made them too much money. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much
Hi.
for a great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I wanted to ask you about another example that I think fits in with what you're talking about, but it's later. So because your book goes through 1795.
1795, right.
So I think it is in 1790, George Washington writes this beautiful letter to the Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, right?
He does.
And in that letter, he says, it's one of the most eloquent defenses, not just of religious freedom, but he says, hey, Jews, you don't have to worry. The U.S. government is not going to sanction bigotry, and we don't persecute people. And yet, how does that rhetoric join with he still, the sad ending to your last book, where Washington just won't free the slaves while he's alive?
Despite the fact that John Laurens and Lafayette, who was like his son, and Alexander Hamilton, and of course Benjamin Franklin, his co-equal, and yeah, he won't. And I think that's an important story. But I think what he wrote to the to the temple in Rhode Island, he really believed that. He believed every word of it. It was similar that on the weekend, the Sunday after he was elected as president of the Constitutional Convention, and therefore president of it, leading it, he chooses 2 days later, Sunday, to go to a Catholic church where he'd never been before and worship in a Catholic church, saying, we're going to be a different sort of country. We're not. And I think he believed those things. And I think and now you have to get into his head, just like you have to get into Jefferson's. And that's why I think one of his great biographers called Jefferson the American Sphinx. How do you get into his head? And you also have to play out that Washington, without telling anyone, on his deathbed, frees his own slaves. What's he thinking? Where is he? We know his various letters on this issue while he's grappling it, when people are calling him to, but we also know that he doesn't free them during his lifetime. And so that's, so in so many ways, America had to deal with this conflict. We know that Patrick Henry thought slavery was wrong. He said so. Yet he never freed any enslaved people. He kept them and he perpetuated it. We think Madison didn't, but he perpetuates slavery, and so does Jefferson. So, you do get some people affirmatively supporting slavery, but not really during the Revolutionary era. That really comes back more in the 1790s. In the Revolutionary era, they kept them, and there was this important issue, but that is the dichotomy. That's the American inheritance. We're coming out of that legacy. And so where the northern states, in absolutely unique acts, abolished slavery, there wasn't a precedent for that. The Southerners effectively doubled down. And by the Constitutional Convention, they really do double down.
Yeah, I have a question here. So I'm trying to understand the extent of the rage of the colonists in being taxed, such as the stamp tax. And I'm wondering, first of all, to what extent was the tax actually highly economically burdensome? We talk about it entirely as a principled issue, but I'm wondering how if it was in fact just principle or whether it was quite burdensome, and instead was it because they're being colonies, they had exclusive trading relationships with a mother country, and therefore they may have been starting off from a sense of being exploited because they couldn't get whatever prices. It was sort of the economic terms were sort of dictated to them, and they may have felt that they were already being pressed and treated in unequal ways, bridging their liberty due to the basic economic structure of the colonial system.
It's a little of both. There were certainly other acts following, basically before the French and Indian War. England just let the colonies develop, mostly. And the way England profited off the colonies is the colonies bought English goods and produced goods like fish from New England or timber from New England or rice from the Carolinas, tobacco that they couldn't produce at home. So it was, and their merchants gained money by carrying the trade. And the merchants, remember, Parliament was not widely elected body. Only about 2% of English people could vote for Parliament. It was mostly from the cities. The free cities had representation in the House of Commons. It was mostly the merchants. So the people who controlled the House of Commons, there was the House of Lords too, which had real power, and those were the established landowners. You had other burdensome obligations that they objected to, like the proclamation of 1763 that prevented settlement in the frontier, the Quebec Act. There certainly were other things that there were other ways they were treated as second class. They viewed as seeing as subservient. And they thought, we are equal. We're British citizens, just like anybody in England, and we're equal with those people. And they were getting rich. What changed over time is some of the colonists became really wealthy, and they had homes in England. They went to England often. They sent their sons to England for school, and they didn't like being treated as second-class citizens. As for your initial, though, so it's on that background. Now you ask, were these taxes really onerous? No, they weren't particularly onerous. The colonies, though, already taxed themselves. And the colonies then contributed to the British revenue during the war, contributed supports, gave troops. I mean, you know, when they finally did take the Forks of the Ohio, it was American militia. When the British fort up in Cape Breton Island, was it Cape Breton Island, up in what's now Nova Scotia, fell, it was mostly a Massachusetts militia. So Americans were already, colonists were already contributing. But it wasn't insignificant. The Stamp Act was a real tax. It wasn't hugely onerous, but it was, on top of all the other local taxes, it was a tax not on imports, but on any printed article, whether it's a newspaper or a legal document or a deed or, you know, a deck of playing cards or a poster. And you had to buy a stamp and put on it, you know, like the old liquor stamps we had when we were young. And it was not insignificant, but it hit even a deeper principle. They didn't like the others, but one thing they knew about England, and they knew from the Civil War in England back a century earlier, which all Americans loved the English Civil War, was that that the king can impose taxes. That taxes have to be passed by Parliament. And now, so they're hitting that principle, that sense that whatever else they can do, the king can declare a war on his own, but he can impose taxes. And it was the ultimate check of Commons and the Lords on the monarch, that they could withhold money. And eventually the king would have to stop whatever he was doing that they objected to. And so here, Parliament was directly imposing taxes. And while they weren't that much at first, though they weren't insignificant, when you combine them with the Sugar Act taxes and then the Townshend duties, They were lower than what England was paying, but England wasn't also paying their own colonies taxes, but they knew they could be increased indefinitely. And what would stop, and this is what they'd write about, what's to stop them from, once they take this, what's to stop them? Every time Parliament wants to raise money, rather than impose taxes on themselves, they can just raise taxes on the colonists, and who's to object? They'll still be reelected. And they don't have to pay them themselves. So they were viewed that so three, my answers were three. First, it's part of a whole series of acts that seem to make them purely subordinate and not co-equal. Second, they ran into a fundamental principle of English liberty that you can't tax in particular. And finally, they were infinitely raisable. And so you got to stop it now or it'll just keep getting worse. So those were the arguments and those were the sense, and you could really read that in their letters and in their comments, but it also snuck into their published articles as well. Long answer, sorry, but it was a good question.
One more question.
And I know people are going to have to go, so Stephen's in charge of this. We probably should.
Do one more question.
Okay.
Yes, if I can. I'm glad to be in your audience tonight. Thank you. As you talk about the birth of a nation and we talk about how thought progresses over a period of time, in my mind, I'd like to know a little more concerning First Continental Congress and the idea that we're going to come together as more than just the people, my neighbors in this community or the people I know in my colony. How do we organize that first Congress? Who is it that has the idea that we should do it? And how do they ever think of who to invite?
The First Continental Congress, which was in 1776, which was brought in response to the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, followed on the heels of, there was the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, where representatives from the various colonies, some of them, got together to sort of coordinate and organize resistance to the Stamp Act. So there was precedent. They knew there were these separate colonies, but they equally, or they all suffered from a common oppression. And so there were already the committees on correspondence coordinating, writing back and forth, and the committees on correspondence coordinated a lot of activity. But they realized that no one colony can stand alone. One colony can't stand alone against England. We have to do this as a group. And they wanted to include Canada. They wanted to include the Caribbean colonies. They were all invited. And so so there was this precedent, both the Stamp Act Congress and the Committees on Correspondence, and agreeing through these Committees on Correspondence to have joint boycotts to the Townsend duties and to the Stamp Act and to the Sugar Act. But then when England tries to split the colonies by enforcing, because of the Boston Tea Party, in a particular way against Boston, to close the harbor, therefore, and it's a trading colony, remember, so that's shutting down its economy, abolish its charter, abolish its legislature, recreate, send in a military governor, basically take away all their economic and political rights. The idea was, okay, we're going to make an example of Massachusetts and everyone's going to be scared and act what? The reverse happened. They were already linked enough that when Virginia said, let's all get together and meet, when Massachusetts echoed that call, they did so. And they said, we've got to stand together because they may knock off Massachusetts now, then next they may knock off Virginia, then they may knock off Pennsylvania. We've got to stand together. So there was already enough of a sense. Franklin was already calling himself an American, for example. There was already enough of a sense that our lots are bound together, at least as the mainland British, English-based colonies, the 13 of them, that were enough together that we are all going to go. And so what they did is they sent out a letter inviting every colony that's willing to come. It goes out to the legislature. In some places, the royal governor has already abolished the legislature, but then a rump legislature or a legislature of those who disagreed, such as in Virginia or Massachusetts, they just elect delegates. And each state, it was 12 states that went in the First Continental Congress. They all went down to coordinate their resistance. And what they voted for is, until Britain gets rid of the intolerable acts on Massachusetts, we are going to impose a really strict boycott. Because you knew with a boycott, why was America valuable to England? Mostly because of a trading relationship. And you're going to hit the merchants who control commons. So you're going to hit them where it hurts. And so it's a controlled boycott. But then the final thing they do before going home is, because they met during the summer, was we're going to meet again in a year, next May, in a second Continental Congress to gauge how much we've gotten and how we need to tweak this response. And what had happened is, in the meantime, just before it happened, the Battle of Lexington and Concord occurred. Britain decided to really clamp down on Massachusetts. And so John Adams could tour the battlefield and then go down and give a report to what had actually happened. The large scale battle that had occurred, especially on the march back, both in Lexington, bigger in Concord, and the march back, and the fact they were using troops. And that made the Second Continental Congress, which Georgia showed up to, so they had all 13 colonies, that made that the one that continued throughout the war and led to the Declaration of Independence. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Larson.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for being such a great audience. Dr. Larson's going to be up here in the front signing books, and we have them for sale out in the hall.